Imagine you're a doctor working in an emergency room and a patient comes in having been in a car accident. You do a quick exam and find that they can feel touch on one side of their body but not the other. And yet, for pain and temperature, they feel it on the opposite side as touch. So, what's going on here? Probably the patient has a hemisection through the spinal cord, where half of the spinal cord has been damaged, but the other half is fine. So, in today's video, we're going to try and figure out how you can predict the kind of deficits that will happen after a hemisection. So first off, let's start with this slide that we saw in lecture. This is showing the pathway for the touch receptors that's going from the periphery into the spinal cord, up through the medulla, and into the brain. First off, let's note that the left and right sides are labeled and maybe different than what you expect. This is just the way that these diagrams are. They're always the opposite of what you're seeing. So left is on the right side and right is on the left side. Okay, so I'll keep those labels there for all of the other pictures. So let's just talk through the pathway here. So we have touch neurons here, and they are entering the spinal cord through the dorsal side, right? And that axon goes all the way up through the spinal cord on the same side, up to the medulla, the brainstem, and it makes a synapse in the medulla. The second neuron then crosses over to the other side, travels up to the thalamus, inside of the brain, makes another synapse, and then the third neuron goes up to the somatosensory cortex. Note that because of the crossover, if you're feeling touch on the right side, those neurons, that circuit, is going to the left side of the brain. So one thing that's confusing about these diagrams is that they don't draw in the opposite side. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So let's say that we're doing touch on the left side, right? So we have touch coming in on the left side, maybe from the fingers. So that neuron is going to enter into the spinal cord on the left side, right? And it has its cell body outside of the spinal cord in the dorsal root ganglion. This neuron then travels upward, it ascends into the medulla, and it makes a synapse. And then the second neuron crosses over and goes up to the thalamus on the opposite side, and then the third neuron goes into the somatosensory cortex. Okay, so even though in that diagram it only showed touch coming in on the right side, of course we know that you can feel things on the left side of your body, and these neurons just mirror what's in this diagram. Okay, and again, the main point here is that the crossover happens in the medulla, not in the spinal cord. So let's look at pathway for pain and for temperature. So these are two different kinds of neurons, but they travel in the same pathway. So if we go through this diagram, here's our nociceptor. And again, it enters into the spinal cord through the dorsal side, correct? And then it immediately makes a synapse. This is different than touch, right? Touch went all the way up to the medulla. So in pain, it immediately makes a synapse in the spinal cord. The second neuron crosses over, travels all the way up on the opposite side of the spinal cord, goes up to the thalamus, makes a synapse, and then you have your third neuron going to the somatosensory cortex. So I'm going to go ahead and draw in the opposite side just so we have that. So you can feel pain, of course, on your left side as well. So this neuron would enter in through the dorsal side and then immediately make a synapse onto the second neuron. The second neuron is going to cross over, head on up through the medulla, doesn't make a synapse there, and then it goes to the thalamus. The third neuron then goes to the somatosensory cortex. Okay, so both touch and for pain and for temperature, the opposite somatosensory cortex, the opposite side, is receiving the information, right? So right touch and right pain goes to the left side of the somatosensory cortex, but the difference is where they actually cross. So once again, touch crosses in the medulla, pain and temperature crosses in the spinal cord. So I drew a much simpler version of these pathways here. So this is showing touch neurons from both the right and the left coming into the spinal cord. They travel up on their own sides of the spinal cord, and then they cross the medulla and then head up to the opposite side of the cortex. Okay, so that's for touch. So now let's look at pain together. So for pain and temperature, again, the neuron comes into the spinal cord, makes a synapse, crosses over, goes up the opposite side of the spinal cord to the thalamus and then to the cortex. Okay, so let's look at a slide. So I know there's a lot of lines here. It's a little confusing, but we can just follow the colors, right? So again, touch travels up on the same side, pain crosses over and travels up on the other side. So let's see what happens if we have a patient who has had a hemisection, so only half of the spinal cord is damaged. And let's say that the hemisection is on the right side. Okay, so I'll just draw a big black line here to indicate that there's been some sort of an injury. And when we talk about a hemisection, what that means is that the axons are being severed. Okay, so any axon that's traveling through that area of the spinal cord has been damaged, and it will not pass an action potential across the injury site. Okay, so for example, if we look at this touch neuron here, it has an action potential. The action potential is heading on up, going on up, but then it can't go past that injury site. Okay, so if we then follow the pathway past that, we can see that everything past here is not going to happen. There's no action potentials. This neuron's not going to have an action potential. And the left side of the cortex is not going to receive that touch information. So if the cortex doesn't receive the signal from the sensory neuron, then we don't perceive the sense, right? So the person who's had the injury on the right side will not be able to feel touch on the right side because that action potential that was triggered by the touch on the right side is can't go past the injury site. It's stuck. It's stuck in the spinal cord. It can't go up to the cortex. Okay, so in other words, this person here is going to feel no touch on the right side. And also, just to be clear, this would be touch that is going into the spinal cord below the injury site. So if it was touch, like say on the right side of the face, that information is fine. That's still going into the brain, no problem, right? So the injury is only going to affect the areas below it. Okay, so like the legs, you wouldn't be able to feel touch in the legs on the right side. Now let's look at the pain neuron right below it and see if what's going on there. So it has an action potential that comes into the spinal cord. It activates the second neuron. It also has an action potential that goes on up the spinal cord, and lo and behold, it makes it to the cortex, right? So eventually the cortex is going to receive that signal. So in other words, this pathway is intact, and they'll be able to feel pain and temperature on their right side. But now let's look at pain and temperature on the left side. Okay, so over here, if you activate the left side with a painful stimulus or with a change in temperature, you activate the neurons, you get an action potential that transfers over to the second neuron. It also has an action potential, and we go on up the spinal cord, and we hit the injury site. Okay, so this signal from the left side regarding pain and temperature is not going to be able to make it past the injury site because those axons have been severed. And so this will not go up to the cortex, will not go up to the thalamus. And since the cortex is not receiving that signal, then you're not going to be able to perceive that stimulus. You're not going to be able to perceive pain and temperature from the left side, right? So that's the key here. So no pain or temperature stimuli will be perceived on the left side. Okay, so that's how you end up with this differential in terms of deficits when you have a hemisection. So it's the key, again, is because the touch neurons cross over in the medulla, so they travel up the same side of the spinal cord as the stimulus, but the pain and temperature neurons cross over right away, and they travel up the spinal cord on the opposite side. Okay, so now you understand, and if you're ever working in the emergency room, have a patient come in with a hemisection, you'll be able to diagnose where the injury site is.